it's costing them over 1,000 troops a day. In the past 24 hours, the Russians have lost over 1,300 troops. They've lost over 28 artillery systems. They've lost over 12 tanks, and they're losing those sorts of numbers on a daily basis, and that is, frankly, unsustainable, no matter how big your military force is, no matter how capable it is.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by former Colonel Philip Ingram, MBE, a former military intelligence officer with more than 26 years of experience in the UK Armed Forces, and a former NATO planner. He's now a well-respected military analyst and commentator. Philip, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
It's good to be back on again.
Let's start by talking about Russia's summer offensive. Is it fair to say it's failed?
It's not been successful. Whether that's the same as it's failed, I think is slightly different. They're making some small advances. They're capturing elements of territory. They've got the Ukrainian military under quite severe pressure across large parts of the front line. And therefore, if anyone was examining it, they would say that they're having some successes. But it's coming at huge cost. It's costing them over 1,000 troops a day. In the past 24 hours, the Russians have lost over 1,300 troops. They've lost over 28 artillery systems. They've lost over 12 tanks, and they're losing those sorts of numbers on a daily basis, and that is, frankly, unsustainable. No matter how big your military force is, no matter how capable it is, you're losing little bits of experience, what experience they've got left every time they lose these troops. And the equipment they're losing is the stuff that's working. The stuff that they're not putting forward is the stuff that's not working or is not up to the same sort of grade. So overall, from a tactical perspective, I think the Russians are under pressure, even though they're advancing. From an operational level and a strategic level, they're losing, and they're losing heavily.
I mean, it's interesting when people describe Russia's losses as unsustainable. I mean, I agree with you up to the point that if they were US losses, if they were British losses, we would see them as being unsustainable. But other people would say, actually, if you're Vladimir Putin, if you are Russia throughout history, they have a different attitude to expending human life. They're happy to put people into the meat grinder. Increasingly, the people serving on the front line are convicts and migrants who've had very little training. Is it really unsustainable?
It is, and there's a couple of reasons I say that. First of all, if we go back to Russia's involvement in Afghanistan, the thing that pushed Russia to leave Afghanistan was the mothers of the soldiers, because there were so many body bags coming back. It was less than 50,000. It was significantly less than the casualties that are coming back today. So that level of pressure hasn't built up yet. That's an indication of the level of control that Vladimir Putin's got over the information operation domestically, and his ability to influence the Russian thinking in that this is an existential conflict against NATO, protecting Russia and Russia's very existence. That can only last for a certain period of time. But then looking at more practical issues, you highlighted it there in that we're getting more migrants coming in. We're getting more overseas troops coming in. We've got Vladimir Putin and his Wagner group recruiting in Africa and getting African troops in. We've seen the deal that he's done with North Korea to get North Korean troops in. The African troops are very, very poorly trained, if at all. The North Korean troops are highly trained, but have got zero combat experience whatsoever and work in a very serialized environment. But if he's having to turn to places like that to get manpower, to get him some form of experience, that suggests that he's in real difficulties. He can get as many other individuals, give them a couple of weeks or a couple of days training on how to use an AK-47 or different variants of it and shove them into the front line, and they will just be decimated, as they are being at the moment. It is a meat grinder, and that is something that is relentless to the Ukrainians, because they can see the attacks coming in and they can see that they're killing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of human beings on a daily basis, and that will have a toll on the Ukrainians, and it's costing them as well. But nowhere near to the same sort of numbers. But we're in that attritional warfare phase at the moment, where the Ukrainians are trying to hold the Russians back until they can build up their capability that's been promised by the West for so long, and then start to have a greater effect on the front line, as well as elsewhere.
I take your distinction between not describing the offensive as a failure, maybe describing it as not being successful. But I mean, there will be people who say, given the delay in Western military aid, given the issues that Ukraine have had with mobilization as well, it is surprising that Russia haven't been able to take more territory so far in 2024. Why is that?
Yeah, it's very surprising. If you look at Russian tactics, what they seem to be doing is penny packeting their military troops on the ground. They're sending one or two tanks, maybe a maximum 10, 15 tanks into a particular attack. That's a big attack. That's, a company group level attack. We'd expect the Russians to be coming in with regimental or divisional level of attacks to have an effect, to concentrate the force on the Ukrainian front line and punch through. That tells me they don't have the command and control capability to do that. They don't have the equipment to do that. They don't have the trained manpower to do that, because it's really quite complex. And we're seeing their aircraft flying in support, but not coordinated completely with what's going on the ground. So everything is happening sort of randomly across the front line, under different commands, but not being coordinated. And that's the principal reason why the Russians are not having an effect. They haven't got that ability to coordinate an all arms and a combined effort to attack one or two weak points on the Ukrainian front line and punch the way through. If they could do that, the Ukrainians are under pressure, and the Russians could punch the way through and have a greater effect. But the Ukrainians seem pretty well prepared from a defensive perspective, and are holding them off.
How effective would you say Ukrainian long range missile and drone strikes against strategic targets inside Russia have been?
I think they've been very successful, and they're getting increasingly successful. This is putting real pressure on to Vladimir Putin. Effectively, that if you include the maritime drones, have effectively decimated the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine is a country without a navy anymore. That is strategically significant. We're seeing the attacks on the oil refineries. That is impacting Russia economically. And we're starting to hear the first whispers of rationing going on and the petrol pumps across Russia. That will have an impact and bring this much more into the public domain. We're seeing more success on drones attacking Russian airfields at extremely long distances, up to 1,000 kilometers away from the Ukrainian front line. And whether it's one drone gets through and explodes, whether it has a military effect or not, that doesn't matter. It's having a psychological effect at a political level. And that's something that is forcing Vladimir Putin to wake up to, and having to spread the the reducing number of air defense assets that he's got over a much wider area, and then to push those aircraft and other capabilities that are having an effect by firing missiles at Ukraine much further back to try and protect them. Again, that is limiting what he can do with them. And the Ukrainians are showing increasingly, and they're using increasingly domestically produced drones and other capability. They're showing increasingly that they can have an effect on that. That's only going to get better for the Ukrainians and worse for the Russians.
You touched on the Russian Navy there, and the way the Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed in large part. What do you make of Vladimir Putin launching Russian naval drills in the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific, also in the Caspian Sea and the Baltic as well, reportedly involving most of the Russian fleet?
Well, it'll involve most of the Russian fleet that's working. There's vast parts of the Russian fleet that don't work. Their only aircraft carrier, which caught fire in dry dock, is unlikely to actually hit the high seas again. It's not scheduled to be out, I think, until 2026 or later. And therefore, what Vladimir Putin is still trying to do is to push out to those that are Russia's supporters across the world, to try and suggest that Russia is still a global power. And in many ways, it is still a global power. It can produce naval forces in the Atlantic, in the Pacific. The Black Sea is where it can't, but it can still produce naval forces in the Mediterranean. So it has got that global influence. And we have to remember that Russia is a key part of the BRICS community. And showing that global power to them is important. They're showing off to China to say, look, we are still this global power. Come and support us. We can work together. And we're seeing the joint exercises between Russia and China, and interesting Belarus and China. But take Belarus and read that as Russia and Russian influence. But it's trying to bring China closer on board. This is all Vladimir Putin trying to suggest that he's in a much stronger position than he is in reality.
I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, Russia is said to have the world's third biggest navy. And yet, as you describe, the Black Sea Fleet has been, largely destroyed, or certainly partly destroyed, by a country essentially without a navy.
Yeah.
How has that been allowed to happen? How has Russia allowed the Black Sea Fleet to be degraded to such an extent?
Well, you can expand that to how is Russia, with the third largest army in the world, allowed a country with a very small army to hold it back and not let it achieve its operational objectives. I think it's down to the way that the Russian military have trained in the past, and the way the Russian military has been sustained in the past. If we look at it from a sustainment perspective, first of all, a lot of the repairs that should have been done to Russian equipment and naval vessels are very complicated, haven't been done. But those individuals, admirals and others responsible for it, have taken the cash for that. Corruption has been rife in the logistics support across the Russian military, their army, but also into their navy and into their air force, which is why we're not seeing decisive action by the Russian air force. And then when it comes to training, the Russians are very good at putting little displays on and going out and sail a little group of ships up and down to do a few things. But a lot of their training regimes are scripted. So whenever the senior officer is there visiting, whenever the senior politician is there observing it, they have got set serials. Between X time and Y time, 3 ships will steam in that direction, do a hard left turn, and fire 3 missiles, and that's what they do. But that doesn't put it into the context of warfare, and it doesn't put it into the context of what the Ukrainians are exhibiting against them, irregular warfare or special operations executive type warfare. And the Russians had never prepared for sea drone attacks or anything else. They thought themselves invincible because of their might and because of their, in inverted commas, reputation. They had over-egged their own capabilities, and the Ukrainians knew that. They've trained closely with the Russians beforehand. Many of the Ukrainian officers have been to Russian Staff College and elsewhere. They are, some of them, family friends and connections with Russian officers. They know the psyche, but they also know the Western psyche. And the Ukrainians have been very clever and been able to combine the two together, look at the vulnerabilities and exploit those vulnerabilities.
Let's talk about the F-16 fighter jets. The mood music is that their arrival in Ukraine is imminent. Is it your sense, Philip, that the first we will know of them will be when they have carried out an attack?
I suspect that they're already the first ones. The Ukrainians will be training with them quite hard, trying to keep them protected. They will carry out 1 or 2 small operations with them just to give the pilots confidence in the airframe, the weapon systems, and everything else. The United States, I understand, have agreed to give the sophisticated weapons that are needed to turn the F-16 into the powerful platform that it is. But again, we're hearing, and this is only open source, that the Ukrainians have only got half a dozen of them. It's going to be a while before they get the mass that they need to have that effect. So what the Ukrainians will be looking at doing is trying to find an opportunity to use them in an ambush situation to send a clear message to the Russians that, hey, they've arrived and we've got you and we've got the weapons, because that will have that psychological effect on the Russians' ability to protect their front line with their air forces and want to push their air forces even further back. It'll also put the Russian air defense systems onto a much higher level of alert. And that's not good for Russian pilots. I think Russian air defense has shot down almost as many Russian pilots as Ukrainian air defense has done as well, because, again, lack of training, lack of proper drills, lack of command and control. They see a target, they fire first and ask questions later.
I mean, the F-16s have been described sometimes as a game changer, but are you saying that, if they do only have a handful of them, and given the issues with training, that's probably overhyped for the time being at least?
In the early days, it's overhyped. They need to be able to create a mass. They need to be able to create a mass to provide at least local air superiority over an area of the battlefield where the Ukrainians want to have an effect on the ground and concentrate their armored forces and punch through the Russians. Until they get the masses to be able to do that, and that means being able to have almost a 24/7 close air support capability, and then a combat capability above that to keep the Russian Air Force back. That takes time, that takes mass, that takes training. So it's not something that I think is going to be here during this year, during 2024. It's something that the Ukrainians will be working up to in 2025. But the Ukrainians will also want to have pre-operations to destroy as many of the Russian Air Force as possible. So they'll try and force them out. And when they're confident that they can use the F-16s from as much of a standoff range as possible, and they've got the weapon systems, the missiles, the intelligence feeds, and everything else to have that effect on the Russian air forces and destroy as many as possible in the air. That'll push the Russians even further back. They need to do that before they even contemplate supporting ground operations. So we've got a long way to go yet before we'll see the proper effect from the F-16s. And it takes the numbers, it takes the pilots trained. It takes the pilots trained not just in flying the aircraft. This is where people get really mixed up with it. Yes, you could probably put an experienced fast jet pilot into an F-16 and he can take it off and he can land it again if you're lucky. And he or she is lucky, but you can't fight it. And if you can't fight it, you'll die. It's too complicated.
You are, of course, a former military intelligence officer, Philip. I just wanted to get your take on the events last week on Friday in France, and we saw an arson attack on the French rail network. Suspicions have been raised, and some people have raised suspicions against Russia. We do not know fully what happened in that case, but what is your reading of the situation?
Yeah, I've literally just done a little video on that for a Twitter handle called On the Brink, looking at the issues that are going on around warfare and our potential move to World War III. I'm looking at it with a degree of suspicion. The French have said this is the far left. It's too sophisticated. If the far left were that upset, why have they not carried out these sort of attacks beforehand? The Olympics, yes, it gives that focal point for them. It gives that platform for them to try and exploit. But also the Olympics, from a political perspective, geopolitical perspective, the Russians have been excluded because of their doping scandals and everything else, have been excluded for a number of years now. If we look at previous Olympics, the Russians have tried to interfere with the Olympics through information operations, stealing data and leaking personal medical data of athletes out onto the dark web and elsewhere. But they've also been carrying out cyber attacks and disrupting activities that are going on. This is taking that to the next level. The disruption of the high-speed rail network, and now the disruption of their fiber optic cable network and communications network. This is something that it would take a group a lot of time, a lot of preparation, and a lot of capability to prepare to do that. And it's not something that would just pop up. The Russians have got a fantastic unit within their GRU, their military intelligence organization, their first directorate, and it's Unit 29155. And it's their responsibility to carry out these sorts of operations all around the world. And they're very good at it. And it's something the Russians are exceptionally good at. That's the unit that provided Colonels Mishkin and Chepiga that carried out the Novichok attack on Sergei Skripal in Salisbury. It's also been linked to a number of other attacks around Europe in different places. And of course, we're seeing some strange fires occurring in factories, military-related factories and warehouses across Europe, including in London, and all the speculation is linking back into them. There's too much coincidence going on. But of course, they're experts at making sure that there is clear blue water between them and those that are carrying out the attacks so that there's plausible deniability. And it can't come back as finger pointing directly at the Russian state, because that would be interesting politically.
One thing we do know for certain is there was a Russian national arrested last week in France by the authorities on suspicion of trying to sabotage the Olympics. And so your sense is, Philip, even if we don't know for certain, it would be consistent with Russia's modus operandi over recent years.
Very much so. And if you were to ask me to come down one way or the other on the 50-50 mark, I'd say, hand on heart, I believe that Russia is behind it. There's just too much circumstantial evidence pointing to that. But that's a gut feeling that I haven't got any evidence really to sit down and look at that and give a degree of certainty.
Just finally, since we last spoke, Philip, the state of the US presidential race has fundamentally changed. Joe Biden has withdrawn. Kamala Harris is now the presumptive nominee for the Democrats. And of course, a lot of people have said that the most consequential election this year, far more consequential than the Russian election, if you can call it that, earlier this year, is, in the context of the war in Ukraine, what happens in America in November. If Kamala Harris were to defeat Donald Trump, what does that do to Vladimir Putin's entire strategy for the war?
Well, yeah, Vladimir Putin's entire strategy for the war, he's lost it strategically already. He didn't want NATO expansionism. He wanted to topple Zelensky, so he's lost that. This would take it one step further, and he's influencing the US elections as much as he possibly can. It's almost certain that his favoured option is Donald Trump. There's been enough circumstantial reporting around that, and I would go one step further to say that there's a closer relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin than would necessarily be considered healthy. So if Kamala Harris gets in, again, that's not certain at the moment. It will mean that Putin has lost his ability to influence what's going on directly. He will try every other method that he possibly can, because we've seen with Joe Biden, we've seen with the issues in domestic issues in the United States, where the Speaker of the House has delayed aid going to Ukraine and all the rest. There's a lot of other levers that Putin can pull. And we'll see him starting to concentrate on those if he genuinely thinks that Kamala Harris is going to beat Donald Trump. But we've had a clear statement, I think, from Donald Trump, who's turned around and said, he will finish the war in Ukraine very quickly indeed. He did say within 24 hours, but very quickly indeed, by giving Ukraine everything that it needs to defeat the Russians. That wouldn't have gone down well with Vladimir Putin, but it could have been a double bluff or a triple bluff. You never know in politics. There is so many promises that are made during election campaigns that then turn out to be completely false whenever the election actually happens and one side or another side gets into power.
Philip Ingram, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.